You're listening to the Write Project podcast and radio program, a show about writing and modern Newfoundland author culture. This program is produced and recorded at CHMR FM 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, and is aired on other great stations in the province and elsewhere in the country. It can also be heard online at www.chmr.ca. I'm your host, Matthew LeDrew. Welcome to a very special episode of the Write Project podcast. Today, we've got a host of authors on to answer one of the most frequent questions that's asked of any author. We're asking them, what are the ethics of writing about historical figures? And today to answer, we have on Ellen Curtis, who is the author of the Infinity series from Engine Books, as well as the editor of the From the Rock anthology. In your mind, Ellen, what are the ethics of writing about historical figures?
So, this is frustrating for me, because I feel like this is another kind of tightrope walking scenario.
For you talking about it, or for the authors that do it?
For the authors that do it. So, I think if enough time has passed, and this kind of goes back to like the questions that a lot of historians ask of themselves is like, when does it become, or archaeologists, let's say, when does it become archaeology instead of grave robbing? And I think that is the same kind of scenario. Yeah. I think that's the same kind of scenario for writing historical figures. I grew up loving historical fiction, but more and more I find myself really uncomfortable with some historical fiction in particular.
I know you have a problem with some historical fiction that involves original people or First Nations people or things like that.
Oh yeah, like very, very frustrated. Like, my family has Beothic heritage, and even though that's a part of my history, it's something that I don't feel comfortable writing about because we don't know the culture, because it has been destroyed. And I'm always left feeling very uncomfortable when I do hear people writing from that perspective.
Yeah.
And I mean, no disrespect to the people who choose to do that, but I think there is often a level of appropriation it leaves me feeling very gross.
Yeah, absolutely. There's also, there's a long, storied history, and it is, again, that's a good analogy, actually, like the archaeology. At what point is archaeology and not grave robbing?
Yeah.
That's interesting. Like, Disney, I know you like this movie, but there's a lot of controversy around it. Disney had no problem doing it with Pocahontas, but there were a lot of liberties taken.
Oh, well, so here's my thing there. So here's my thing. Growing up, Pocahontas and Tiger Lily were two of the only characters I saw who I would see when I looked in the mirror, because growing up, I was much darker than my friends, and I had very dark hair and dark eyes, and I got called out a lot for being very different because my sister was so blonde and pale and blue-eyed, and people were like, are you adopted even? So that representation was very important for me, and as an adult now looking back, that's very frustrating because that wasn't good representation, but that was all we had. Yeah. Pocahontas'
representation goes, the character from Disney, she as a character, if you divorce her from the fact that she's a historical figure, it's not the worst.
I think there are still a lot of problems with that narrative.
No, you know what? The narrative, fine. The character herself. There's still some issues now that I'm thinking about it. As I'm thinking more and more.
I think we can pick it apart and
that could be a whole episode.
Sure. But I think that speaks to the importance of representation in fiction, and that's why I get really frustrated when people are like, "Oh, are you like talking about authors?" And it's like, "Oh, why are they going out of their way to include someone who checks X, Y, and Z box?" And it's like, well, because there are
X, Y, and Z people out there.
People are out there and they're looking for representation, and representation is important.
Yeah.
You could say it all day. Representation is important.
Yeah, that's fair. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Morgan Murray, author. Currently, he has the book Dirty Birds with Breakwater Book. Morgan Murray. Morgan Murray, what are the ethics, in your mind, of writing about historical figures, if there are any ethics surrounding that, when you're writing about real people that are really lived but are no longer with us?
That's a good question, because in my novel Dirty Birds, I have Leonard Cohen figures prominently as a fairly significant character. And the ethics around that, it depends on what kind of book it is, I think. If it's, if you're writing a nonfiction biography of somebody or a historical book or something, then there's probably some necessity to stick to the facts. But if it's fiction, if it's like mine is very satirical, I think you're allowed a certain degree of latitude, especially if they're a well-known public figure who portrayed a certain character publicly. You can sort of use that to build up your book a little bit and tell your story, and I don't think you have to be too worried about being haunted or anything. But if Leonard Cohen does haunt me, that'll make a good second book.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's interesting. I actually hadn't thought about that when I asked you the question. Like, I was thinking like historical figures. I was thinking like 1890s and beyond. But you're right. That is even though it's recent history, that is a valid. I was thinking that it didn't pertain to you, and I was asking you to answer something kind of in abstract. But you're right. That actually does play. That's interesting.
And I started writing it with him in it before he passed away, and then after he died, I felt less nervous about it.
Well, you can't be sued now.
And I'm safe. But not him, but a different editor, like the editor of the book, and a few people I had read different parts of it. One of the first questions I was asked is, "Does this have to be Leonard Cohen?"
Yeah.
And through,
couldn't it be Cohen Leonard?
Yeah. Could it be somebody like him but not him? Somebody that looks like him and acts like him and talks like him, but
well, he's got two first names. You could have easily just gone Cohen Leonard.
Yeah, and disguised him. But those are good questions to ask in the editing process, because then you have to sort of defend what the choices you made were. But I came to the conclusion that it has to be Leonard Cohen. For a number of reasons, and stuck with it, and I think it's good that I did. But if there's some like really diehard Cohen fans who read the book, they might protest that it's historically inaccurate. But that,
I mean, what's his name? God, I can't remember the author's name, and he's a famous Newfoundland author, and that's horrible right now. You're going to remember the second I say it. But Colony of Unrequited Dreams.
Yeah, Wayne Johnston.
Wayne, you're right, yeah, and he's one of my favorite authors, but from the Divine Ryans, not from that. But, Wayne Johnston, when he did the Colony of Unrequited Dreams, he got a lot of flack for Joey Smallwood, and I'm kind of like, he can take it. You know what I mean? Like, it's fiction. It's funny, because you were saying at the beginning of your answer, almost like a qualification, that if you're writing a historical biography and stuff like that, like a nonfiction, then you have a greater responsibility. I find that in abstract is true, but in practice doesn't happen. Like, I find the most slanted stuff, if you want to read a slanted, they cherry-pick the truth version of a person, read a biography of that person written by someone else. Because it will either be this big takedown where they're saying all this bad stuff the person did, or it will be a loving tribute that is so glowing that there's no mud on the person at all, and it's like they're Jesus resurrected. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Whereas I find, and both those things, the takedown and the holding up, portray themselves as being true, even if they're both about the same person. When really something in the middle would be the most accurate and true. But I find that fiction can actually be better because it wears its untruth on its sleeve. You know, like, this isn't meant to be a completely accurate representation of Smallwood or Cohen or whoever. So let's have some fun with it. It's not meant to be taken that seriously. And in that way, I find fiction is better than nonfiction because at least we're not pretending to be accurate. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think part of it, too, is that your ultimate ethical responsibility, I think, as a writer is to the story and what you're trying to say. And you're trying to make a point. And biographies often have a political slant to them. One of my favorite things to do, and I didn't know this until I went to one, was to visit presidential libraries in the U.S.
Yep.
And I've been to Jimmy Carter's and Lyndon Johnson's. Jimmy Carter's is in Atlanta, and Lyndon Johnson's is in Austin, Texas. And there are these beautiful museums, and Jimmy Carter has some like a civil right or human rights research center attached to it, and Lyndon Johnson's is on the U of T campus, and it's this big University of Texas campus, and it's this big thing. And just stunning buildings and everything. But Jimmy Carter, I think it was a genuinely nice human being. Still is.
Yeah,
He's
I agree.
Not dead yet. But Lyndon Johnson was a very complicated president and a very complicated guy.
Yeah.
Not all good. He started the Vietnam War. All of this stuff. Very complicated guy. But when you walk through their presidential libraries, you get such a glowing image of how wonderful these men were and how perfect they were. And my favorite was, not for it being interesting, but because for it walking that line, of the glowing line, was they had this like choose your own adventure in the Vietnam War section of Johnson's museum, where you basically did this like computer game where you had to make all the same decisions that he had to make and see if you could come to a different outcome. And like every decision tree, they had it programmed so it ended up starting the war. You couldn't avoid it. As if to say, he really didn't want to, but he had to. He didn't have a choice. He had to invade Vietnam.
That
Poor
ignores
guy.
some key choices that I can think of right off the top of my head.
Yeah. So they're very problematic, but the one thing that they do a little bit is you get a better sense of the guy, and you need more of you need to go in with some historical context and knowledge, or seek some out afterwards to get a fuller picture, but you get a certain element of it. But like in Colony of Unrequited Dreams, and hopefully with Dirty Birds and Leonard Cohen, you take sort of a caricature of a real life person and you use certain characteristics that they played up or whatever, and you take some of the sort of mythology around them and you use that to tell a story that has a point, that has theme, that has insight into all of these things. So in some ways you have to get down to like the more essential elements of that character to use them in that way. So hopefully I was able to get at some of the things of Leonard Cohen, because for Milton Ontario, the protagonist of the novel, he's not that smart and he's not that talented and he's kind of an idiot. But
knowing how much of it you based on your youth, that is damning.
I was an idiot. Probably still am.
We all were.
But oh yeah, we should. I don't want to encourage everybody to write novels when they're idiots, but it's good ground to cover. Very fertile. But Leonard Cohen was Milton Ontario's hero for particular reasons, because he was a famous poet, he was rich and powerful, and most of all, he was a ladies' man. And all of those things were true about Leonard Cohen in one way or another, but he also exhibited, certain traits of masculinity which weren't all that cool. He was a ladies' man, and often if you're a ladies' man, there's some wishy-washy gray area about how ethically you're relating to the women you're womanizing with and all this stuff. So there's all these sort of problematic aspects of Leonard Cohen's real life, the womanizing part of it. Most of his songs, if you listen to it, I made a playlist of sort of all the songs that I allude to or cite or whatever in the book. And I had been listening to it way too much. But most of his songs are about hooking up.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he had the permission of the women in the book or in the songs to go out and sell 1 million copies of his hooking up songs. Or they're just like really gross songs about his penis and stuff. And you're like, oh, this is gross. But it's that type of masculinity I wanted to bring into the book and have Milton sort of aspire to that, because he's the whole sort of plot of the book is he's on this quest to find meaning and purpose to his life, and he thinks that's the thing. If he can attain that kind of masculinity that Leonard Cohen has, he will have made it. And he gets close enough to see that that's not true. And so hopefully, in how I use Leonard Cohen in the book, I can say more about Milton and his story and the themes of the book I'm trying to get at, but also sort of highlight a few truths about Leonard Cohen as well that maybe aren't always the things we immediately think about when we think about Leonard Cohen, because he's so beloved, which is, when you spend a lot of time with him dwelling on some of the less savory elements of his character, you start to wonder, like, why is he so beloved? Yeah. This is a weird song about his mother's a prostitute, and the song's all about an erection. Yeah. It's weird stuff.
Yeah, that's fair. It's not unfair. Thank you. It's a good answer. Great answer.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Erin Vance, Editor-in-Chief of Engine Books and the editor of the From the Rock anthology series. In your mind, what are the ethics of writing historical figures?
I've never written a historical figure. I think, gosh, that would take so much research. Because I think my main thing about writing a historical figure, are you talking about someone in historical times or an actual figure from history?
An actual person who lived.
I think the best way to do that would be to narrate them from an outsider.
That's fair.
Yeah, I think the only way you could actually
So rather than writing Martin Luther King, you write someone who sees Martin Luther King.
Yes, because the thing is there's such a thing, so unless your whole point is to change the way people view them, and the only way you should do that is if you know a heck of a lot about that subject. Yeah. I'm talking like a professor in a university, heck of a lot, to devote their life to it. Yeah. Other than that, there's a reason why they are viewed that way, and unless you have a solid reason to change that view, you probably shouldn't go messing with it.
What about, do you watch Doctor Who?
I tried to get into it, couldn't get into it.
But they often do historicals, so they'll go sometimes even to the fairly recent past. They did an episode about where they went back to the moon landing and had him interact with Richard Nixon and the Nixon administration.
Oh, cool.
And stuff like that. But in genre fiction, that can happen in historical fiction, historical romances, but also in genre fiction, with time travel and stuff like that. Yeah. How do you feel about the use of characters who are, sometimes it's...
I don't really have a problem when people do it, as long as, they're showing the respect due, or disrespect that it's due, because sometimes the whole point is to undermine it or something. Yeah. And again, usually when that happens, it's because they've done their research. Yeah. I just wouldn't feel comfortable doing it, because for me, I'd be like, you want me to write about, King David? Yeah. No thanks, man.
Yeah. 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 Well, the earliest example of that, we'll cut this out, I guess, but maybe. But the earliest example that I can think of, I'm sure there are earlier ones, is Macbeth. Macbeth was a real king. Yeah. But nobody remembers the real king. Mm-hmm. Everyone remembers the Shakespeare play, which is wildly different from the king. It has supernatural elements when that clearly wasn't real and stuff like this. I compare it to what if in 100 years nobody remembered who Abraham Lincoln was, but everyone remembered Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. That's what Macbeth is like.
I guess, but then you kind of really have to wonder how good of a sense of humor they have.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah. Because maybe Abraham Lincoln would think that's hilarious.
He might.
And maybe Macbeth is you know what? My life was so messed up, it might as well have been controlled by witches.
That's fair.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Next on the line, we have Amanda Labonte, author of the Call of the Sea and Supernatural Causes series. Amanda, what are the ethics of writing about real-life historical figures? Are there any things around that we should consider?
So the legality of it is if they're dead, you can't get in trouble.
Yeah.
Living historical figures are problematic because they're real people. So from a legal perspective, sure. I think I don't have a problem writing about historical figures. I don't tend to do it because I'm not a history buff, but I don't think I do.
This is
Actually, you know what? In steampunk, I probably... No, you know what? I'm rewriting history, so I don't have to. I think that the only issue is to not take somebody else's history and rewrite it. The movie example is Back to the Future, when they go back in time and rewrite Johnny Be Good.
So that rock and roll was invented by a white guy?
By a white guy, and that's, sure, let's bring in historical figures, and let's bring in historical figures of color, and then, let's take away things from them. Doctor Who has to walk that line.
Yeah.
Because they deal with a lot of historical figures, and I know you haven't watched the more recent seasons, but, they deal with a lot of historical figures, and there's always this, on-edge thing where, you don't want the Doctor doing that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You don't want it to be a situation where the Doctor made it so that, a historical figure discovered
Rosa Parks,
something.
I believe, is the
example. Yeah, that was a really good episode. They did that really well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, but again, that's not my history. So I just look at it and I think they drew attention to a historical figure that apparently a lot of people hadn't, particularly outside the States, hadn't paid a lot of attention to. Which I didn't know because we're in Canada and we do, but apparently, there were, in the UK and stuff, she wasn't as well known, and drew attention to her without taking away what she did.
That's good.
Within a fictionalized context.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question becomes, it's almost, there's a question, every discipline, when you get into, study, every discipline has a question at the core of it that is unanswerable, that's difficult. The one for archaeology, from my archaeology friends, is at what time frame is it not archaeology but grave robbing? And I feel like that applies. Tabloid, this is a gross example, but I was really disgusted by it. Tabloids printing stuff legally because you can't get sued because he's dead about Heath Ledger right after he died, a week later, he had a love child and this and that. To me, that's grave robbing. He's not a historical figure yet. Yes, you can legally do this, but you shouldn't.
Right.
So at what point do you get far enough away that it's no longer grave robbing writing, but is archaeology writing?
I mean, are you writing something that you would be embarrassed for this person's living relatives to read?
That is fair. That is
if you're writing a historical fiction in Newfoundland set in the 50s or the 60s, and you don't mention Joey Smallwood, that's problematic.
Yeah.
Because he existed. If you're being realistic, but if you mention him but he has lots of living relatives around, but you talk about him in a way that is vilifying, I guess it's a compassion thing. It's what you personally can handle from, I would not want to write something that somebody's, family could be hurt by.
Yeah. Yeah. Ideally.
Because I'm doing fiction. I'm not doing, a nonfiction, for the historical record kind of situation. I'm doing, where I have to be accurate, and even if somebody did bad things, it kind of has to go in there. I'm not doing that. So, for me... it's your comfort level.
Yeah.
But I get what you're saying.
And everyone's going to respond differently to that. To me, even though Joey has living relatives, Joey's up for grabs just like Nixon is. I mean, Joey's way before Nixon, but nobody has a problem with...
saying anything that he did, legitimately is fine, but, if you're going to then say, and he was a monster and kicked dogs, and you don't really know that, you're
gonna, I would never say that
kind of stuff. I'm you can.
Yeah.
Legally you're allowed, but, but why would you... What are you trying to get out of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Next on the line, we have Alicia Morrissey. In your opinion, what are the ethics of writing about historical figures?
It's funny because I love historical fiction. I love biographies and autobiographies. In terms of the ethics, again, I think you need to get the facts right. I think the times and the dates and things like that should probably be there. I went through a bit of a period where I read everything that Philippa Gregory wrote about the Tudors, and I really loved those books for their technical historical accuracies, but the conversations were obviously all made up, and a lot of the fun bits were thrown in there. I mean, we didn't know what happened to the Tudors day to day, so that was the enjoyable part. But it was nice that the history wasn't far off the mark.
Yeah.
The rules were in place, and I think that ethically is really interesting. The other book that I immediately thought of was, when you asked that question, was Lincoln in the Bardo.
Okay.
Which, it's funny because it's written by an author who, George Saunders, I believe is his name, who actually writes a lot of very historically accurate novels, and not even novels so much as they're historical documents almost. But this book was set as a play. It was set around the time that Abraham Lincoln's son died, and the night that he died, Abraham Lincoln visited him at his gravesite, and that novel was fascinating because all of the information was correct, but the characters that were surrounding it and the story, the playfulness, the somber tone, everything about it was very fun and interesting and kept me turning pages, even though it was written in a very unique way, and it told a story that couldn't possibly be true. So I think when writing historical events, you can't let your reader down by not doing the research. You have to include the facts, but you can play with that. You can definitely make it more entertaining.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah.
So what about something related to that? What about something like, you and I both love this show, but like Doctor Who, or to do it from a novel like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter? Like you're taking this historical thing and putting fantasticalness in it. Like what's your thoughts on that? I think it's fine, but living descendants can sometimes it can be trouble. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is supposed to be entertainment value. I think the Doctor Who episode you might be referring to is the Rosa Parks episode.
That was brought up when I asked Amanda Labonte this question.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because, again, the facts were true.
Yeah.
Rosa Parks remained seated on a bus in Alabama after a long day at work. Granted, it's slightly more accurate in the episode because she really was tired from doing activism work, not just as a seamstress. But those kinds of things, very much like Lincoln in the Bardo, which is, again, the characters in that book are the ghosts in the graveyard. Yeah. Looking at Abraham Lincoln from the outside. Like, you can inject so much fun and so much interest into those kinds of stories. And if your facts are there, then maybe somebody learns something too. Yeah. So is it an ethical question? I mean, look, you can go completely off the wall and do revisionist history, which I actually find very fun and very entertaining to read. But I do try and Google things when I'm reading. Was this the correct date? Was this character really real? We just finished Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Tower. And of course, I'm Googling all the German names, the Nazis, trying to make sure that his facts were accurate. I think with the invention of Google and fact checking, the reader has an opportunity now, like never before, to see if your story is real or not.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, so that may be one of my ethical hangups, that you should at least get your facts straight.
That's fair. That is very fair. All right, well, thanks for coming on again. For all of you, we'll be here again next week at 4:30 Newfoundland time or online at chmr.ca. Please tune in and we'll talk more about writing culture in Newfoundland.